Hey, Beau, do you think that cancel culture is eliminating debate from our society?
This is a really important question, and why? Because it speaks to um, the current and the future state of our society and societies. It also speaks to the emotional well-being or lack thereof of ourselves, younger generations, and so let's think about first of all the concept of cancel, the cancel culture, or just canceling. Um, why is it so important thinking about well-being? And it's very early in the morning, so I'm just waking up here, but I woke up with thinking about this. The sun's just rising over there. The sea's behind me, so it's a beautiful morning to think about this. And I've got Monkey here sitting here. So canceling. Why is canceling such a threat to people? The reason is because during evolution, you didn't evolve to be an individual. You evolved to be social. And the reason is because you couldn't survive on your own. You can't survive on your own. This, we have this illusion of independence. None of us are independent. We're all dependent at the most fundamental level, not just emotionally, but also physically. Um, and so during evolution, if you were excommunicated, you died. So deep within our brain is a fundamental need to belong. And so as a consequence, I take issue with the current thinking that the younger generations are fragile. In some sense, we're all increasingly fragile physically. I mean, if you think about what life was like even 100 years ago, 50 years ago, but now consider 300, 400, 500 years ago, we are we're wimps compared to physically what we have to tolerate now compared to what was tolerated and people thrived in. So in that sense, we're all increasingly fragile. Uh, but let's think about it as it's typically in terms of emotional fragility. Well, my gremlins, they're in the early 20s. They're facing an issue that I really never had to face. At a certain smaller level, I did, but not at this societal level. And that's what canceling is about. It's about excommunicating you, separating you. Now, wild dogs in Africa, if they misbehave, they're it's canceled. It's excommunicated. It's kicked outside the group. It's not killed immediately. It's just kicked out because they know that it will eventually die. So as the troop moves on, um, the the canceled wild dog will just follow along at a distance, and eventually it will just wither and die. In my lab of misfits research, um, we do artificial intelligence. We do evolve artificial life systems, and what we found is that when these artificial life systems evolve in a very simple environment, they can live individually. But as soon as you layer in some complexity in the form of uncertainty, what emerges is multicellularity, right? You lose your ability to do certain functions and you become part of a larger whole. So we've argued that the evolution of multicellularity itself is a function of uncertainty. And the increased uncertainty, the more uncertainty you have, the more you need a community. And so I think that actually our young people, my gremlins, are facing a challenge that we've never had to really face before at this most fundamental level, which is the challenge of being canceled, the challenge of excommunication. And that is an existential fear. And through social media, this is just being amplified and, in particular, used in order to get people to have more likes, to this addiction to being acknowledged and then eventually validated. So, first of all, that's what canceling is actually about. It's about triggering this deep seated need and fear we have to belong. And that is an existential threat that our younger generations are facing, which is basically exponentially increased because of social media. So I think in some sense, they are facing a threat that we haven't faced before. So rather than thinking about them as fragile, let's think about actually the threat that's being faced that is is in some sense novel at this scale. So yes, that will actually inhibit debate. And why is that important? Because debate, let's think about debate more generally, because I'm not a huge fan of debate. Debate is actually a situation where you and I have a conflict, and my aim is actually to prove that you're wrong and to shift you towards me. And your aim is exactly the opposite, to prove that I'm wrong and to shift me towards you. So the aim of debate is usually to enter a conflict with a desire to win and not learn. Because notice, you only ever learn when you move. Have you ever learned from not moving? By definition, the answer is no. What's more is that you've never probably learned anything from the position of knowing. You only ever learn from the position of not knowing. Again, literally by definition. So conflict is actually essential for expanding yourself. You've only ever learned from conflict. And it doesn't have to be conflict with another person. It could be conflict when you go into a new location and you don't know where you're supposed to go. Conflict for me is defined as being in a situation that's different from what you expect, in conflict. The problem is we enter conflict desire to stand still. Why? Because we have such a fear of uncertainty. And what's more, if I give you data to show that you're actually wrong, and you've tied your identity to that, your brain is more likely to hold stronger to that view than it is to let go of it. So cancel culture is preventing us going to the very place that we evolved to learn. So we have this tremendous toxic combination of an existential threat and preventing ourselves from learning. It's diabolical. So what would happen if when we entered conflict, we entered not with certainty, not with the desire to convince, the desire to be validated, but instead we entered conflict with a question, with the humility of not knowing, with the desire to move, the desire to actually understand another person. Because when it comes to debate or conflict, if you can only ever speak to people, if you seek validation, there are very few people you can speak to. Very few people have your view, much less your specific view, your nuanced view. But if you seek the desire to understand or to be understood, you can speak to almost anyone. Right? And what's more, how could you validate someone if you don't actually understand them? And how could you ever understand them if you haven't entered that conflict with a question rather than with an answer? So what do we need? We need more, not confidence, we need more courage. Courage to risk the possibility of being excommunicated. And this is where your prefrontal cortex gets involved. Yes, we have this existential fear of being excommunicated, but that is a reflexive response grounded in evolution. We've also evolved the prefrontal cortex, which enables you to actually look away from the obvious, to say, you know what? I appreciate that is the reflex, but learning and expanding myself are so essential that I'm going to risk the possibility of being excommunicated. And I'm going to overcome that reflexive response by activating my prefrontal cortex. And so I'm going to choose to deviate, which is the whole point of my book, Deviate, which is not to deviate away from the norm, it's to deviate to yourself, to be a misfit, hence the lab of misfits, which maybe if you're listening, you're a part of now. In fact, you are a misfit. We all are a misfit. Okay? It's about having the courage to embrace that. And in doing so, that will increase your humility and increase your desire to expand yourself. And to expand yourself means seeking understanding. And you can only seek understanding if you're entering conflict, if you're seeking it, not to convince another person, but to understand them. And I think that's what we need a great deal more of. So, task for today, seek conflict, but seek creative conflict. Seek to expand yourself, seek to understand, and have that courage to risk the possibility of being outside the norm. Because nothing interesting happens at the average. It only happens outside the average.